If you look at really ancient maps, I'm talking about the ones drawn by cartographers centuries or, even millennia ago, there is this really fascinating psychological phenomenon that happens right at the edges of the parchment.
Oh, right, where they just run out of information?
Exactly. The mapmaker charts out the familiar world, right? They draw the rivers their people trade on, the coastlines they've navigated, the mountain ranges that border their kingdoms. But inevitably, the ink reaches the frontier of their empirical knowledge.
They hit the wall.
They hit the unknown. And instead of just, leaving that space blank, they draw sea monsters. They sketch out these enormous, terrifying leviathans and literally write, "Here be dragons."
It's a deeply ingrained human reflex. When we hit the edge of our understanding, we really don't like the vacuum.
No, we hate it.
Right. An empty space on a map implies vulnerability, so our imaginations just kind of take over. We would way rather populate the unknown with a terrifying myth than admit a gap in our data.
And cartographers did it with geography, but historians do the exact same thing with time.
Oh, absolutely.
So today, we are taking you, the listener, into a famous historical text that has been treated like a literal fantasy novel for centuries. We're going to strip away the monsters, the folklore, and the dragons to reveal what is actually hiding underneath.
And it is a lot more complex than the myths, that's for sure.
It really is. We are pulling from an incredibly dense analytical source today. It's Lecture 5 of 9 from Allama G.A. Parwez's audio series on Surah Al-Kahf of the Quran. Specifically, we are zooming in on Ayat 83.
Right.
And just to set the expectations for you right out of the gate, if you're anticipating, like, a traditional dogmatic theological sermon today, you are in the wrong place. We are examining this text purely through the lens of political science, historical sociology, and statecraft.
Yeah, because the focus here is a historical figure referenced in the text as Dhul-Qarnayn. And for hundreds of years, this name has been entirely shrouded in mythological folklore.
Just totally buried in it.
Exactly. And Parwez's analysis basically takes a scalpel to that folklore. The goal today is to demonstrate that Ayat 83 isn't a fairy tale about some ancient superhero. It is a highly calculated analytical paradigm of global power.
A master blueprint.
Yes, it's a literal blueprint for how a superpower achieves and maintains absolute dominion without, destroying itself in the process.
But, to understand the blueprint, we first have to look at the monster the mapmakers drew, right?
We have to talk about the horns.
We have to talk about the horns. For centuries, the standard medieval interpretation painted a picture of Dhul-Qarnayn that reads like a comic book. Because of a hyper-literal translation of the text, people genuinely believed this was a literal king who wandered the ancient earth fighting physical monsters.
Yeah.
And the defining characteristic, the whole reason he was so famous in the folklore, was that he supposedly had 2 actual physical horns growing right out of his human skull.
A literal horned warrior king just roaming the desert. When you view the text through that lens, you completely blind yourself to the actual geopolitical reality that's being discussed.
I was actually trying to figure out how a historical interpretation goes that far off the rails, and it made me think of a modern parallel.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine someone 2,000 years from now digging through the digital archives of the 20th century, and they keep finding references to the Iron Curtain dividing Europe.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Right. If those future historians lack the cultural context of our idioms, they might write these massive, serious academic papers theorizing about the metallurgical logistics of the Soviet Union forging a literal 2,000-mile-long drape made of solid cast iron.
They'd be having fierce debates over how the hinges work.
Exactly.
And they would be so obsessed with the physical impossibility of the Iron Curtain that they would completely miss the devastating political reality of the Cold War.
They'd miss the whole point.
They really would. And that is the exact trap of taking ancient Semitic and Middle Eastern idioms at face value.
So, okay, pull us out of the trap. If we drop the literalist comic book reading, what did the phrase Dhul-Qarnayn actually mean to the people utilizing that language at the time?
Well, we have to break down the linguistics of the era. The phrase Dhul-Qarnayn translates directly to the possessor of 2 horns. But in the ancient linguistic frameworks of the Middle East, the root word korn, which means horn, it wasn't used to describe biological anatomy in a political context.
So no weird bone growths on the forehead?
No bone growths. It was a sharp, widely understood geopolitical idiom.
Wait, so if it didn't mean a physical horn, what was the everyday usage? Like, how would a merchant or a diplomat in antiquity use the word corn?
They used it to denote a distinct epoch. like a sweeping generation or a mighty unrivaled empire. Think about the modern shorthand we use today.
Like what?
Like when a political analyst talks about the American century, they aren't talking about a literal 100-year clock ticking down.
Right.
They're describing an era defined by a specific hegemony and, sphere of influence. In antiquity, Quorn functioned similarly. It represented a summit of power. So Dhul-Qarnayn, the possessor of two horns, meant a dual empire.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it referred to a multi-continental governmental apparatus whose operational reach extended comprehensively from the eastern horizon to the western horizon.
So it's basically a title of supreme geopolitical capability means you control the two extreme poles of the known world.
Exactly. And Parwez's source material doesn't just offer this as like a clever linguistic theory. The text maps this specific idiom onto concrete historical reality.
So there's a real guy.
There is a real guy.
Yeah.
Dhul-Qarnayn maps perfectly onto one of the most consequential architects of empire in human history, which is Cyrus the Great.
Okay, the founder of the Achaemenid Empire in the 6th century BCE. And depending on the ancient Persian dialect, he's also referred to as Khusro or Khusro.
Right.
But why does Cyrus specifically get the title of the dual empire? What were his two horns?
Because Cyrus achieved a geopolitical fusion that was just unprecedented at the time. He didn't just conquer randomly. He structurally united two massive, historically distinct kingdoms, the Kingdom of Media and the Kingdom of Persia.
Okay.
Those two united realms were the literal two horns of his superpower state. By fusing the Medes and the Persians, he created a singular, unrivaled global machine.
And the source material points out a piece of hard archaeological evidence that makes this undeniable, which I just loved.
Oh, the statue, yes.
Yeah. This isn't just retrofitting an ancient text to fit a historical figure. The idiom was physically manifested by Cyrus himself.
Right. You are referring to the statue at Pasargada. This is where the empirical evidence aligns perfectly with the linguistic analysis. In the ancient ruins of Pasargada, which is located in modern-day Iran, archaeologists documented a relief, a stone carving of Cyrus the Great that dates back centuries.
And it has the horns.
It does. The crowning feature of this depiction of Cyrus is a specific, elaborate headdress. It is a crown that explicitly incorporates two distinct towering horns.
He was literally wearing the geopolitical idiom on his head. The two horns on the crown represent the Kingdom of Media and the Kingdom of Persia. It was basically his administration's official logo.
It was a physical symbol of his dual hegemony. So when the ancient texts refer to Dhul-Qarnayn, they are not talking about a mutant from a fairy tale. They are pointing to a specific, documented historical paradigm.
A real-world superpower.
Exactly. They are pointing to an era where a single administration achieved total industrial, military, and logistical dominance over the known world.
Which completely changes the nature of the text we're reading. We aren't reading mythology, we're reading political science.
Exactly.
And that shift in perspective forces us to look really closely at the actual phrasing used in Ayat 83. The way the verse opens is crucial. It says, they ask you about Dhul-Qarnayn. Say, I will recite to you a mention or a reminder, and the Arabic word used there is dhikr of him.
And the entire analytical framework hinges on how you translate and understand that specific word, dhikr.
Right, because if you're a literalist waiting for a bedtime story, you read, I will recite to you a reminder, as an invitation for a narrative.
Like a campfire story.
Exactly. It sounds like a grandfather saying, gather around the fire, let me tell you an epic tale about a king from long ago. It implies the text is about to offer historical trivia or a comforting fable.
And that assumption is precisely what Parwez's thesis violently rejects. To treat this text as mere historical gossip is to fundamentally misunderstand its architecture.
So what does deek mean here?
Well, in this specific context, the word dhikr operates much closer to a scientific or objective case study. The text is not giving you the biography of Cyrus the Great because it thinks you need a history lesson on Persian genealogy. It is doing something far more rigorous.
It's treating history as a laboratory.
Yes. The text utilizes history as an empirical equation. It isolates specific variables, like what happens when a human society achieves unrivaled military supremacy? What happens when it masters massive industrial output? What happens when its geographical reach becomes boundless?
It's testing those inputs.
Right. It takes those variables, runs them through the laboratory of human behavior, and establishes the unyielding laws of what we can call social physics.
But, okay, let me challenge that premise for a second. If the goal of the Quran here is to provide a universal, permanent blueprint for global governance, like a set of laws for how a just society should operate in the future, why wrap it in the history of a king from the ancient past?
Well,
I mean, why not just provide a clear, bullet-pointed manifesto? Here are the 10 rules of a just economy. Here are the 5 rules of military engagement. Why rely on history at all?
it's a really critical question, and the answer lies in the difference between theoretical philosophy and applied science. You can write a utopian manifesto filled with abstract principles of justice, but theory doesn't survive contact with reality.
It falls apart in practice.
Exactly. Humans are inherently skeptical of abstract utopianism because it has never been proven to work.
As theory is cheap, anyone can write a book about a perfect society.
Right, but history is undeniable. By using the historical reality of Cyrus the Great, the text is essentially saying this model of just absolute power is not a utopian fantasy. It is physically possible because it was physically built. The equation has already been solved.
Oh, I see.
It uses the past to prove the viability of the future.
That makes total sense. It grounds the blueprint in reality. And that actually brings us to the core catalyst for this entire discussion. The verse begins with the phrase, "They ask you about Dhul-Qarnayn." So we really have to look at the people doing the asking.
The early companions.
Right. Put yourself in the shoes of the companions of the prophet in the early days of the Quranic movement. Why was this specific historical model suddenly so relevant to them?
Looking at their motivations reveals a level of strategic foresight that is almost terrifying, honestly. We have this tendency to view early historical movements through a lens of primitive survival.
Right, they're just scraping by.
Yeah, we assume they were just trying to get through the day, fighting local skirmishes. But Parwez's analysis forces us to confront their actual geopolitical mindset. They weren't asking about Dhul-Qarnayn to win a trivia contest.
No, you have to look at the map of their world at that moment. The early Quranic movement was a relatively small emerging force, and they were geographically sandwiched between the two most dominant, heavily armed, and deeply corrupt superpowers of late antiquity.
The Byzantine Roman Empire to the west and the Sassanid Persian Empire to the east.
Exactly.
Both of those empires were massive, highly sophisticated extraction machines. They survived by conquering territories, levying crushing taxes, and subjugating local populations to feed their capital cities.
Yet, despite being surrounded by these absolute titans, the early companions had the unwavering conviction that they were going to dismantle both of them.
It's wild to think about.
It really is. It wasn't a hypothetical scenario for them. They fully believed that their movement would inevitably inherit the geopolitical footprint of Rome and Persia.
And that absolute conviction is what generated their anxiety. It wasn't fear of losing a battle. It was the existential dread of winning the war.
Okay, unpacking that, why would they dread winning?
Because they were looking closely at the Roman and Persian models of hegemony, and they were horrified by the corruption, the slavery, and the wealth disparity. So the burning operational question they were bringing to the prophet was, when we inevitably achieve global supremacy, how do we handle it? How do we wield absolute military and economic capacity without slowly transforming into the very oppressors we just spent our lives defeating?
Because they knew that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. They were asking for an operational framework to break that historical rule. They wanted to know how to hold the ring of power without turning into Gollum.
That is exactly the dilemma. And the answer the text provided to them was incredibly radical. To truly grasp the shock value of the Dhul-Qarnayn narrative, you have to understand the intense, toxic racial and tribal prejudices that define that specific era.
Oh, yeah. The source material dives into this, bringing up Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, the great Persian epic, to illustrate the cultural landscape. And the animosity between the Arabs and the Persians wasn't just a standard border dispute.
Not at all.
It was deeply woven into their cultural identities.
It was a virulent, systemic ethnocentrism. From the perspective of the Persian imperial court, the Arabs were uncultured, primitive desert dwellers.
They looked down on them.
Completely. The Shahnameh famously immortalizes this disdain, stereotyping the Arabs as violent camel milk drinkers who were completely devoid of civilization. The Persians looked at them with absolute aristocratic contempt.
And the Arabs returned that hatred tenfold. They viewed the Persians as arrogant, opulent tyrants who worshipped fire and subjugated free people. The Arabs were fiercely proud of their tribal lineage, their independence, and their language. They were deeply suspicious of anything foreign, especially anything Persian.
So hold that cultural tension in your mind. An Arab audience, harboring deep-seated racial prejudice against Persians, comes forward asking for the ultimate blueprint for righteous global governance. And how does the Quran respond?
It drops a bomb on them.
It actively holds up Cyrus the Great, a non-Arab, a Persian, a Zoroastrian, as the supreme historical archetype of a just ruler.
It's an absolute demolition of their tribalism.
Okay.
The text essentially says, you want to know what righteous power looks like. Look at the ancestor of your worst enemy. Look at the Persian king.
It forces them to swallow their racial pride in order to access the knowledge. The sociological brilliance of this cannot be overstated. By praising a Persian king to an Arab audience, the text establishes an unyielding principle. True power, justice, and righteous action transcend race.
Right.
They transcend ethnic lineage. They transcend narrow, localized religious labels. Righteousness is defined purely by adherence to universal laws and actions, not by the blood in your veins.
It proves that the mechanics of governance are objective. Gravity doesn't care if you're an Arab or a Persian. If you step off a cliff, you fall. And the social physics of empire don't care about your tribe either. If you build a society on oppression, it will collapse.
Which brings us to the core operating system of this entire paradigm, the law of requital.
The law of cause and effect.
Exactly, applied to human sociology. To understand why Cyrus is the model, we first have to examine the standard input and output of a traditional empire under the law of requital.
Let's break down the mechanics of that traditional empire. Historically, when a hegemon achieves military dominance over a region, the immediate input is extraction. You march your army into a neighboring territory, not to help them, but to drain them.
Right.
You seize their agricultural surplus, you take control of their trade routes, you levy heavy taxes, and you conscript their population for cheap labor or military fodder.
And why do empires do this? Because maintaining a massive standing army and an opulent capital city requires an endless influx of resources. They operate as a geopolitical vacuum.
But the law of requital dictates the inevitable output of that behavior. If you extract grain from a farming region to feed your capital, you starve the local workforce. If the workforce is starving, agricultural output drops. When output drops, your tax revenue falls.
It's a vicious cycle.
And to make up the difference, you send more soldiers to enforce stricter quotas.
And those soldiers cost money, so you have to raise taxes somewhere else, which triggers inflation and economic instability at home. Meanwhile, the oppressed population, who have nothing left to lose, begin to organize resistance.
They revolt.
Exactly. The cost of occupying the territory eventually exceeds the wealth you are extracting from it. The absolute capacity of the empire accelerates its own destruction. It rots from the inside out.
It's a mathematical certainty. So how does the Dhul-Qarnayn model circumvent this? I mean, how do you have an empire without extraction?
The text asserts that true, sustainable global power must be tethered to a Dhul-Qar, an operational realization of universal justice. The superpower must completely decouple its military and industrial capacity from financial extraction.
Which sounds impossible.
It sounds impossible, but again, the source doesn't just theorize this. It points to a massive, documented historical clash to prove it. We have to look at the Babylonian Empire and their interaction with the Israelites.
Okay, this is one of the clearest demonstrations of the law of requital in ancient history. Before Cyrus rose to power, the dominant hegemon was the Babylonian Empire, ruled by King Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar ran a textbook extraction machine.
He was the archetypal oppressive force. The historical record details his siege of Jerusalem in the 6th century BCE. When Babylon conquered the Israelites, they didn't just demand a percentage of their crops. They systematically dismantled their society.
Yeah, they leveled it.
They destroyed Solomon's temple, which was the economic, cultural, and spiritual epicenter of their civilization.
And then he executed a mass deportation. The surviving population was dragged back to Babylon in chains. This is the infamous Babylonian captivity. For nearly a century, the Israelites were enslaved. Their labor was extracted to build Babylonian infrastructure. They were stripped of their wealth and their identity. It was total, devastating colonization.
They were the ultimate victims of the imperial vacuum. The Israelites were writing agonizing laments about their exile, completely powerless against the Babylonian military apparatus. And then the geopolitical paradigm radically shifts. Cyrus the Great Dhul-Qarnayn marches on Babylon.
He defeats the Babylonians and takes control of the entire empire. Now, historically, when one empire conquers another, the new boss is the same as the old boss.
Oh yeah, meet the new boss.
Right. The new conqueror just takes over the extraction machinery. They look at a subjugated workforce like the Israelites and say, great, free labor for my new palaces.
But Cyrus doesn't do that. When he takes control, he initiates a complete reversal of the extraction model. He frees the Israelites, and he doesn't just open the gates and tell them to walk home through the desert.
He actively helps them.
He uses his state capacity to facilitate their return to Jerusalem. He provides them with the logistical support, the wealth, and the resources required to rebuild Solomon's temple.
But okay, I have to stop you there because this is where the theory bumps into reality. I understand the moral victory of freeing slaves, but empires don't run on charity. Maintaining the committed military, securing the borders, funding the logistics of moving a massive population back to Jerusalem, that costs a staggering amount of money.
It's incredibly expensive.
Right. If Cyrus wasn't taxing the Israelites, and he wasn't demanding tribute from the populations he conquered, how was he funding his state? It sounds economically impossible.
That is the brilliance of the system, and it comes down to the difference between an extractive economy and a productive economy. An extractive empire steals a pie and eats it. A productive empire builds a bigger bakery. Cyrus wasn't operating a charity, he was playing a long-term macroeconomic game.
Okay, walk me through the mechanics of that. How does building a bakery work for an empire?
Well, when you brutalize and enslave a population, their economic output plummets. They produce only what they are forced to, and you have to spend immense resources on soldiers just to keep them in line. It's a high-friction, low-yield system.
Makes sense.
Cyrus realized that by freeing the Israelites, returning their stolen wealth, and helping them rebuild their infrastructure, he was transforming a drained, rebellious population into a highly motivated, economically vibrant society.
Oh. And Jerusalem sits on incredibly valuable trade routes.
Exactly.
So by rebuilding the city and empowering the locals, he's basically reviving international trade.
He stimulated their local economy. A prosperous, stable Jerusalem naturally engages in massive trade across the Persian Empire. The wealth generated by that free trade, the innovation, the stability, it enriches the entire empire organically. He didn't need to levy a crushing extractive tax on them because the sheer volume of commerce within his secure borders generated massive prosperity.
Wow.
He traded short-term extraction for long-term stability and economic velocity.
He realized that a wealthy, secure neighbor is far more profitable than a starved, resentful slave. That is a profound shift in statecraft. And what's amazing is how the Quran structures this revelation. The source material points out a fascinating narrative parallel that happens right before the Dhul-Qarnayn story.
You're talking about the story of the unnamed righteous servant, universally recognized in the cultural folklore as Khidr.
Yes, the Khidr narrative. Right before we get the massive, sweeping geopolitical epic of Cyrus, the text tells this small, almost intimate story of Khidr interacting with Moses. Khidr goes around performing these highly specific, localized interventions.
Like the boat.
Yeah. He deliberately damages a boat belonging to some poor fisherman. Why? Because a tyrannical king is coming down the river, confiscating every seaworthy vessel. By making the boat look broken, Khidr saves their livelihood from state extraction.
And then he goes to a hostile village that refuses to offer them food or shelter. He finds a collapsing wall in that village, and he spends his time and labor rebuilding it. For free. And why? Because underneath that wall is a hidden treasure that rightfully belongs to two orphan boys in the city. If the wall fell, the hostile townsfolk would steal the orphan's inheritance.
And the crucial variable in both of those interventions is that Khidr refuses to accept any payment. He uses his knowledge and his physical labor entirely to shield the vulnerable from exploitation, and he demands absolutely no wage in return.
I was reading that and wondering why those two stories were placed right next to each other, and then it clicked. Dhul-Qarnayn is the exact same blueprint, it just scaled up to a global level.
Khidr is the micro.
And Cyrus is the macro.
It's a fractal structure. The text introduces the principle on an individual level so you can grasp the morality of it. A righteous individual uses their personal capacity to protect a few orphans without demanding a fee. Then, the text immediately projects that exact same principle onto the canvas of global statecraft.
It's demanding that an administration wielding supreme military and economic power must operate with the exact same selfless protective instinct as an individual helping an orphan.
That's a huge leap.
It is, but Cyrus, using the Persian army to protect the Israelites without extracting tribute, is the geopolitical equivalent of Khidr fixing the wall for free. State power is designed to be a shield, not a vacuum.
That synthesis is the beating heart of Parwez's entire thesis. It fundamentally redefines the purpose of power. But, as you pointed out earlier, theory requires execution. It's one thing to have a benevolent philosophy, it's another thing to physically manage the logistics of a global empire in a hostile world.
Right, the real world is messy.
Exactly. How does this blueprint handle the violent reality of physical expansion? because the world Cyrus lived in wasn't peaceful. He had to secure his borders against real existential threats.
And that is where the narrative shifts from the theoretical physics of power to immense physical engineering and military logistics. The source material outlines three massive, distinct campaigns undertaken by Dhul-Qarnayn, which map the staggering geographical reach of his state mechanism.
Let's break down these campaigns because the sheer scale is mind-boggling. The first campaign drives the empire's reach far to the west.
The text describes reaching a murky spring or a dark body of water. Geographically and historically, this aligns with Cyrus's expansion toward the Black Sea and the Aegean coast.
Yeah.
And when his forces arrive, they don't find a peaceful vacuum. They encounter a chaotic, rebellious nation characterized by oppression and internal tyranny.
And how does the blueprint dictate he handle them? I mean, does he just wipe them out?
No. The mandate of the superpower is not annihilation, it is the establishment of universal justice. The text explicitly outlines that Dhul-Qarnayn punishes the oppressors, he dismantles the tyrannical hierarchy, but he actively protects and elevates those who are being victimized.
So it's surgical.
Exactly. He establishes a perimeter of stability on his western border, not by mass slaughter, but by enforcing a rigorous, equitable rule of law.
He neutralizes the threat by instituting justice, which naturally pacifies the region, because the western flank is secure. Then the entire military and logistical apparatus pivots and launches a second massive campaign pushing to the extreme east.
This campaign pushes deep into the regions of Balkh and Bactria. And the sociological challenge here is entirely different. He doesn't encounter a rival empire. He encounters primitive, nomadic tribes.
Right.
The text describes them as a people who had no shelter from the sun, meaning they lacked basic architectural infrastructure and were completely exposed to the harsh elements.
Now, historically, an empire encountering a primitive, disorganized tribe sees only one thing: easy prey. You sweep in, you enslave them, you take their land, and they don't have the technology to fight back. It is the ultimate temptation for extraction.
But the superpower blueprint forbids it. Dhul-Qarnayn extends his protective umbrella over these nomadic populations. He secures the eastern frontier, but he does it without exploiting their primitive status.
He just provides stability.
Yes. He establishes order and provides security, allowing them to exist without being crushed by the wheels of imperial progress.
It's the restraint of power that proves its legitimacy. But the true climax of this entire narrative, the ultimate stress test of the superpower's structural parameters, happens in the third campaign. This one pushes north into a treacherous, vital mountain pass.
Geographically, we are looking at the regions around the Dardanelles, or the volatile passes of the Caucasus Mountains. Here, the state mechanism encounters a terrifying geopolitical crisis.
What's the crisis?
They find a weak, terrorized nation situated near a geographical breach, a gap between two massive mountain ranges. And through this gap, they are being continuously raided, slaughtered, and plundered by savage looting tribes.
The text refers to these marauders as Gog and Magog. And just like Dhul-Qarnayn, that name is heavily shrouded in apocalyptic folklore. But in the analytical context of this blueprint, what do Gog and Magog actually represent?
They represent the antithesis of civilization. They're chaotic, destructive, parasitic forces. They don't build infrastructure, they don't engage in agriculture, they don't establish laws.
They just take.
Exactly. They survive purely by bleeding vulnerable societies dry. They are the ultimate embodiment of violent, unstructured extraction.
So, this terrorized nation sees the massive, disciplined military and industrial power of Dhul-Qarnayn arriving at the pass, and they make a desperate, incredibly revealing proposal. They beg him to use his advanced engineering to build a physical wall, a massive barrier crossing the mountain pass to permanently seal out Gog and Magog.
Right.
But here's the critical detail. They offer to pay him tribute.
They literally say, we will collect a tax among ourselves and pay you for this protection.
They are essentially volunteering to become a vassal state. They are so terrified of the chaotic extraction of Gog and Magog that they are willing to submit to the organized extraction of an empire. They're handing him the right to tax them on a silver platter.
It's wild.
For any standard imperial power, this is the dream scenario. You get paid to expand your borders.
And this is the moment the theoretical physics of power are proven in harsh reality. How does Dhul-Qarnayn respond to this highly lucrative offer?
He flat out rejects the money. He refuses the tribute entirely. He tells them that the capacity and the wealth his Lord has already given him is sufficient. He refuses to bleed a terrified nation dry just to build infrastructure that serves the greater good.
He refuses to create a relationship of financial dependency or indebtedness. But, and this is equally important, he also refuses to treat them like helpless children.
Right.
He doesn't just snap his fingers and have his imperial army build the wall while the locals watch. He mobilizes them.
He says, "Help me with your strength. Bring me blocks of iron."
He provides the advanced state-level industrial engineering. He calculates the metallurgy. The text describes how they heat the massive blocks of iron and then pour molten copper over the top.
Why copper over iron?
Because the copper fills the gaps, prevents the iron from rusting, and creates an impenetrable, fused alloy barrier. He provides the science, but he utilizes their local labor and their local resources.
It is an absolute masterstroke of statecraft. By refusing their money, he proves his justice. By making them build it with him, he empowers them. He elevates their own industrial capacity so they aren't permanently dependent on him.
Exactly.
He secures total regional stability, permanently locks out the parasitic forces of Gog and Magog, and protects a vulnerable society, all without a single coin of exploitative taxation.
It is the perfect synthesis of absolute power and absolute justice. He solves a geopolitical crisis without creating an economic one.
So we've completely dismantled the myth. Dhul-Qarnayn isn't a mutant king with horns from a fairy tale. It is a highly specific, historically proven master blueprint for how a global superpower can expand its reach, secure its borders, and protect the vulnerable without collapsing under the weight of its own greed.
That's the core of it.
But it leaves you with a massive logistical cliffhanger, right? We know what he built, but the sheer administrative scale of managing an empire from the agency to the borders of India without a centralized extractive tax system. How does that machinery actually function day to day?
That is the exact question that drives the next phase of Parwez's analysis. In Lecture 6 of 9, which tracks Ayat 84 through 91, the focus shifts heavily into the administrative mechanics.
Okay.
We will look at how the superpower establishes logistical supply lines, how it maintains decentralized stability, and how it manages the vast, diverse populations within the eastern and western boundaries without relying on oppression. We are going to map the actual day-to-day mechanics of maintaining global justice next time.
I cannot wait to get into the engineering of that. But as we wrap up today's deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a thought to really chew on. Think about the geopolitical landscape we are living in right now.
Oh, this is the big question.
Right. If these ancient, rigorously analytical texts were demanding with absolute clarity that unrivaled military and industrial power must be entirely decoupled from financial extraction, how does our modern global order stack up?
Not well, I'd imagine.
Look closely at the systems we casually refer to as help or development today. Look at the structure of foreign aid. Look at international debt traps disguised as infrastructure loans that force developing nations to privatize their water or their minerals.
Yeah, the modern extraction machine.
Look at the endless military interventions of the 21st century. Are our modern superpowers actually operating like Dhul-Qarnayn? Are they acting as a righteous shield, mobilizing local populations for their own protection and refusing tribute? Or are they just highly sophisticated, modernized versions of Babylon?
Just extractive machines.
Exactly. Extractive machines demanding tribute under the polite disguise of interest rates and trade agreements. I invite you to view every headline you read this week through this ancient, rigorous lens. The dragons and the sea monsters might be gone from our maps, but the terrifying question of how to wield absolute power without destroying the world, that remains the greatest unsolved equation of our time.